there is a silence that exists only in the deepest corners of the cosmos. A silence older than language, older than memory, older than the first stars that learned how to burn. In the Invincible Universe, that silence had long been drowned out by the roar of conquest. The Viltrum Empire spread across the heavens like a slow tide of iron, folding entire civilizations into its shadow. Kings knelt. Republics collapsed. Continents burned under the calm gaze of beings who believed themselves to be the final word in the language of power. For generations, the galaxy accepted this truth. The Viltrumites were the apex. Nothing above them. Nothing beyond them. Every rebellion ended the same way, with a single warrior descending from the sky and rewriting history through the weight of his fists. Fear became the natural currency of the stars, and every world learned to whisper the same prayer, hoping the Empire would look elsewhere tomorrow. Then the disappearances began. At first it seemed like a communication error. A distant colony went dark near the outer arm of a spiral system. Then another. Then an entire cluster of civilizations that had traded goods and stories for over 1,000 years. No distress signals, no final broadcasts, no debris fields drifting through the void. The worlds were simply gone, as though someone had reached down into the fabric of reality and quietly turned them off. The coalition of planets dispatched investigators. They arrived expecting battlefields. They found something far more disturbing. The planets were still there, but stripped down to their bare, lifeless cores. Oceans erased, atmospheres peeled away, mountains reduced to smooth gray stone. Cities that had stood for millennia were now nothing but faint outlines burned into the surface, like memories fading from the mind of a dying god. There were no bodies, no survivors, no screams left echoing in the dust. Only silence, thick and unnatural, pressing down on every scanner and every heartbeat. The reports traveled slowly across the stars, passed from council to council, from scientist to scientist, from empire to empire. Something was moving through the galaxy. Something that did not fight, something that did not conquer. Something that simply arrived, and then a world was no longer a world. Long-range telescopes eventually caught a shape. It drifted between star systems, unhurried, indifferent to distance. At first, observers believed they were looking at a rogue moon, or perhaps a derelict vessel of unknown origin. But the more they studied it, the more the truth began to press against their minds like a rising pressure behind the eyes. The figure had arms. The figure had a helm. The figure walked through the vacuum as though the vacuum itself were a quiet corridor built for his passing. He was taller than mountains, taller than stories. Taller than the imagination of the species that watched him from trembling observatories. His armor caught the light of distant suns and cast it back in colors no artist in this universe had ever named. He did not speak. He did not gesture. He simply moved forward, one slow step at a time, as though the galaxy itself were a garden he had wandered into by accident. Ancient records from a dozen civilizations were dusted off and cross-referenced. In the oldest texts, buried beneath forgotten dialects, a name appeared. A name spoken with reverence in some cultures and with terror in others. A name that had no place in the Invincible Universe, and yet now walked through it as if it had always belonged. Galactus. He was not a conqueror. He was not a tyrant. He carried no flag, no doctrine, no vision of empire. He wanted no thrones, no worshippers, no tribute. He sought only one thing, and that thing was older than desire itself. He sought to feed. And for the first time in the long, bloody history of this universe, every civilization began to understand a truth their weapons could not answer. Something had arrived that could not be negotiated with, could not be conquered, and could not be turned away. The Viltrum Empire did not panic. Panic was a weakness reserved for lesser species. When the first reports reached the high command, they were met with the same cold amusement that had greeted every rumor of a rising threat over the past 10,000 years. Emperors had come and gone. Prophets had risen and fallen. Cults had promised the end of Viltrumite dominance more times than any historian bothered to count. Every one of them had ended the same way, silenced by a single warrior stepping through a doorway. So when the report spoke of vanishing worlds and a figure the size of a moon, the Empire responded the way it always had. With confidence, with disdain, with a reconnaissance fleet. 12 warships were dispatched toward the coordinates. Each vessel carried veterans who had burned continents and shattered planetary defenses without breaking formation. Their commander was a decorated general who had personally ended 3 civilizations in a single campaign. They approached the anomaly with the calm of professionals who had never known defeat. Their final transmission lasted 11 seconds. The first 3 seconds captured the moment they saw him clearly. There was a pause in the audio, a small human sound, something between a breath and a prayer from a soldier who had never prayed in his life. The next 4 seconds recorded the general issuing standard engagement protocols in a voice that had begun, almost imperceptibly, to tremble. The final 4 seconds were not words at all. They were light. A sudden blinding wash of radiance that overwhelmed every sensor, every camera, every listening post within 1,000 light years. Then nothing. Galactus did not turn to face them. He did not raise a hand. He did not even slow his pace. A small ripple of energy left his form, the way a walking man might brush a fly from his sleeve, and 12 warships that had conquered 3 civilizations ceased to exist. No wreckage, no survivors, no last stand written into the annals of Empire. Only a faint disturbance in the fabric of space where a fleet used to be. The recording reached the Viltrum High Command hours later. It was played once, then again. Then a third time in complete silence before anyone in the chamber found the courage to speak. These were beings who had watched entire species extinguished on their orders. They had signed the death warrants of worlds without pausing their meals. And now, for the first time in living memory, the room could not find the words to describe what it had seen. It was not the destruction that shook them. It was the indifference. Galactus had not fought their fleet. He had not acknowledged it. He had walked through it the way a man walks through morning mist, barely aware that the mist had ever been there. For a species that had built its entire identity around the sanctity of strength, the message was devastating. Strength in this presence meant nothing. Strength in this presence was invisible. While the Empire sat frozen in its own reflection, other voices in the galaxy began to move. Mark Grayson stood in the command center of the coalition of planets. Watching the same recording on a smaller screen, his jaw tight, his hands folded behind his back. Around him, alien officers spoke in urgent tongues, coordinating evacuation routes, redirecting refugee vessels, mapping the slow, inevitable path of the entity through nearby systems. Mark did not speak for a long time. He had spent years fighting warlords and tyrants, beings who wanted something, beings who could be reasoned with or broken. This was different. This was weather. This was tide. This was the quiet certainty of a storm that did not care whether you loved your children or feared your gods. He turned to the officers around him and gave the only order that made sense. Save who you can. Move who you must. Buy time by any means available. Across 1,000 worlds, sirens began to sound. Families gathered what they could carry. Ships lifted from spaceports and unbroken streams. And in the highest halls of the Viltrum Empire, for the first time in 10,000 years, a whisper began to spread through the ranks. A whisper that had no place in the language of gods. Mark Grayson had killed more beings than most civilizations had ever produced. He had ended bloodlines, erased cultures, and walked away from massacres with the calm of a man finishing a long day of ordinary labor. He had believed, for most of his very long life, that there was nothing in the universe that could stand above him for long. Even after his exile, even after his imprisonment, even after his slow and painful reckoning with the sun he had once tried to break, that belief had never fully left him. It lived beneath his skin, quiet and patient, like an old religion he could not quite abandon. So when the recording of the reconnaissance fleet reached him, he watched it once, then stood up without a word and walked toward the nearest launch bay. Mark tried to stop him. So did the coalition. So did every voice of reason within 100 light years. Nolan listened to none of them. He did not argue. He did not shout. He simply told his son, in a voice that carried more weight than volume, that if this creature could not be reasoned with, then someone had to test whether it could be hurt. And if anyone in this universe had the right to make that test, it was him. He left Earth alone. The journey took days. He crossed empty systems, drifted through dead star fields, and eventually found the figure moving between 2 dying suns. Nolan had fought in the shadow of many great things. Titan. None of them had prepared him for the moment he first saw Galactus without the filter of a screen. The scale broke something in him. It was not simply that Galactus was large. Largeness was a concept Nolan had made peace with long ago. It was that Galactus existed on a different order of being. Looking at him was like looking at a mountain that was also a thought, a storm that was also a decision, a god that had decided for reasons of its own to wear the shape of a man. Nolan hovered in the void, his cape drifting slowly behind him, and for a long moment he could not remember why he had come. Then his pride returned, as pride always does. He struck first. He struck the way he had struck 1,000 enemies before, with the full weight of his heritage behind him, with the discipline of 10,000 years of combat, with the certainty that he was Mark Grayson of Viltrum, and that his fists had rewritten the history of worlds. He drove himself into the side of that vast helm at a speed that would have shattered planetary crust. Galactus did not move. There was no shockwave, no recoil, no sound. Nolan felt the impact travel back through his own body, through bone and muscle and memory, and he understood, in a single terrible instant, that he had not struck a being. He had struck a fact. He had thrown himself against the concept of hunger itself, and hunger had not noticed. He struck again, and again. He unleashed everything he had ever learned, every technique, every hidden reserve of power he had held back from his son during their worst battles. He screamed into the vacuum, not from rage, but from the growing horror of a man whose entire identity was quietly dissolving in front of him. Galactus finally turned his head. The movement was slow, almost gentle, the way a walking figure might glance at a small sound near his feet. Two eyes the color of dying stars settled on Nolan for the first time. There was no anger in them. There was no cruelty. There was not even curiosity. There was only the vast, patient recognition of something that had seen countless beings like him in countless universes, across countless ages, and had long ago stopped being surprised by any of them. A single motion followed. Not a punch. Not a blast. Something closer to a breath. And Mark Grayson, conqueror of worlds, executioner of civilizations, was thrown across the void like a leaf caught in a gust of autumn wind. He came to rest eventually, drifting among the shattered remains of a small asteroid field, his armor cracked, his lip bleeding, his mind quietly refusing to accept what it had just experienced. He lay there for a long time, staring up at a sky that no longer belonged to him. When he finally returned to Earth, he did not land in triumph. He did not land in defiance. He landed slowly, almost carefully, as if the ground itself might reject him. He walked past his son without a word, then stopped at the edge of the command center, his back to the room. Then he spoke quietly, the way men speak at funerals. The Empire cannot win. The words of Omni-Man traveled faster than any fleet. Within hours, every major power in the galaxy had heard some version of what had happened at the edge of those dying suns. The details shifted from mouth to mouth, but the core of the story remained the same. The strongest son of Viltrum had thrown himself at the intruder, and the intruder had not even paused to acknowledge him. Something inside the galaxy changed that day. Not loudly, not with speeches or declarations. It changed the way a season changes, in small, quiet gestures that only become obvious in hindsight. Old enemies began to speak to one another. The coalition of planets, long the moral counterweight to Viltrumite ambition, opened its channels to the Empire without conditions. There were no demands for apologies. No lists of past crimes to be answered. There was only a single question passed between diplomats who had once refused to sit in the same room. What do you know, and what can you share? Viltrumite commanders, who had spent their entire lives believing negotiation was a weakness, began transmitting star charts, threat assessments, and evacuation windows. Independent civilizations that had spent generations hiding from both sides emerged from their shadows with archives no one had known they possessed. Ancient records, half-forgotten prophecies, scientific theories once dismissed as heresy, all of them poured into a shared network of desperation. In the middle of this slow, uneasy alliance stood Mark Grayson. He did not command the coalition. He did not command the Empire. He commanded, perhaps, only the attention of a room, and even that felt fragile to him. But he had inherited something from both sides of his story. From his father, the discipline to act when others hesitated. From his mother, the stubborn belief that people, even at their worst, were worth saving. And from his own long and painful path, the understanding that strength without compassion was simply another form of ruin. He refused to accept that Galactus could not be answered. If direct combat was impossible, then the question had to change. He gathered scientists, philosophers, historians, and mystics into a single working council. He asked them not how to defeat Galactus, but how to understand him. Where did he come from? What did he truly consume? Was there a pattern to his hunger? Was there a rhythm to his passage through universes? Was there any record anywhere of a world that had survived his arrival? The search took the heroes of Earth across places they had never expected to visit. They walked through the ruins of civilizations that had risen and fallen before the Viltrum Empire had ever drawn its first breath. They spoke with hermits on frozen moons who claimed to have inherited memories from beings older than their own star. They descended into archives buried beneath oceans, where scrolls written in dead languages hinted at a figure that walked between realities, followed by heralds of silver and flame. Every answer opened a larger question. Every mystery pointed toward another, deeper mystery. The universe, which had always seemed vast to Mark, began to feel bottomless. He had once believed he understood the shape of his cosmos. Now he understood that the shape had always been a rumor, and the truth had been waiting patiently beneath it, older than everything he had ever loved. Yet within all of that ancient knowledge, a fragile thread began to appear. Galactus did not need any particular world. He needed energy. He needed life force at a scale most beings could not imagine. But the source of that energy, in theory, did not have to come from populated planets. In certain forgotten texts, there were hints of alternatives. Dying celestial bodies, barren husks of former stars, immense structures adrift in the deep between galaxies, still carrying the raw power of their long-ago creation. Mark began to shape a plan around that thread. It was not a plan built on victory. It was a plan built on redirection, on negotiation, on the strange, quiet hope that even a being like Galactus might, under the right circumstances, be willing to choose one path over another. He did not tell the Viltrumites yet. He did not tell the Coalition. He simply held the idea close to his chest and prepared in his own way to walk toward a conversation no one else in the galaxy was willing to have. Galactus finally spoke. It did not happen in the middle of a battle. It did not happen during a summit or a declaration. It happened quietly in the empty space above a dying world as Mark Grayson hovered alone before the vast figure and refused to move. He had come without weapons. He had come without allies. He had come with nothing but a small transmission device on his shoulder and a heart that would not stop trembling, no matter how many times he told it to be still. He had rehearsed his opening words 100 times on the way there. When the moment arrived, every one of them left him. So he said the only honest thing he could think of. He said, "Please." For a long time, there was no response. The stars behind Galactus continued their slow, indifferent burning. Somewhere in the distance, an old sun collapsed into itself, releasing a soft pulse of light that would take 1,000 years to reach anyone who cared. Mark waited. He had learned over the past months that patience was often the only offering the universe accepted. Then a voice arrived. It did not come through his ears. It arrived somewhere behind his thoughts, a resonance more than a sound, as if a mountain had chosen to whisper directly into the shape of his mind. There was no anger in it. There was no cruelty. There was only weight, the terrible calm weight of something that had been speaking for longer than languages had existed. Galactus told him the truth. He explained that his hunger was not an appetite. It was not a preference. It was a function. He was as old as the current cycle of existence itself, older than the galaxies that framed their conversation, older than the concept of empires and heroes. He had been born, if such a word applied to him, in the collapse of a universe that came before this one. He was, in some sense, the last surviving act of that dead cosmos, threaded into the structure of the new one to keep balance where balance would otherwise fail. Every world he consumed released energies that flowed back into the fabric of reality. Without that flow, he explained, entropy would gather in places it was never meant to gather. Suns would fail before their time. Dimensions would fray at their edges. The delicate machinery that allowed life to exist anywhere in the cosmos would slowly, quietly begin to grind against itself. He did not enjoy this task. He did not despise it. He simply performed it as a heart performs the work of beating, without hatred and without pride. Mark listened. He listened for a long time. When he finally answered, his voice was smaller than he expected, but steadier than he feared. He told Galactus that he understood. He told him that he could see, in the enormity of that explanation, a kind of terrible logic. But he also said, with the stubbornness that had defined his entire life, that logic alone could not be the final word. Every world Galactus consumed contained children who had names, elders who had stories, songs that no other world had ever sung. If balance required their erasure, then perhaps balance itself needed to be questioned, or at least renegotiated. Galactus did not interrupt him. That in itself was a small miracle. Their exchange became something neither of them had expected. It stopped being a confrontation and became a conversation. Mark asked whether creation could exist without destruction. Galactus asked whether meaning could exist without loss. Mark spoke of his mother, of his daughter, of the fragile ordinary lives he had sworn to protect. Galactus spoke of universes he had watched dim and of the strange quiet dignity of things that ended when they were supposed to. Somewhere in the middle of that long, drifting dialogue, something shifted. Word of the exchange traveled back to the fleets waiting at the edge of the system. Viltrumite commanders listened to fragments of it in stunned silence. For beings who had built an entire civilization around the sanctity of raw power, hearing a god of hunger speak with philosophical patience to a young man from Earth was almost more disorienting than the destruction of their fleet had been. They began to wonder, some of them for the first time in their lives, whether the strongest act in the universe might not be a blow at all. Whether it might be, instead, the willingness to stand in front of something vast and simply keep speaking, even when the vastness could crush you without effort. Galactus resumed his journey. Whatever understanding had passed between him and Mark in that quiet stretch of space, it did not turn him aside. It could not. His hunger, as he had explained, was not a mood to be talked out of. It was a tide. Tides did not choose. Tides moved. And so, slowly, inevitably, the vast figure continued through the galaxy, and the direction of his path became unmistakable. He was walking toward Earth. The news reached every corner of the Alliance within hours. Evacuation orders were issued. Fleets were repositioned. Ancient rivalries were finally, formally set aside as ships from a dozen different civilizations gathered above the small blue world at the edge of a modest spiral arm. Viltrumite battle cruisers took up positions beside coalition vessels. Independent freighters filled with volunteers arrived from systems that had never before shown any interest in Earth's fate. It was, in its own strange way, the largest gathering of unified force in the recorded history of the Invincible Universe. They all knew it would not be enough. The final stand began at the outer edge of the solar system. It was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was closer to a ceremony, a chorus of desperate acts performed in the shadow of something that could not be moved. Fleets launched everything they had. Every experimental weapon, every relic recovered from ancient wars, every last reserve of power that could be safely and unsafely unleashed. The void lit up with colors that had no names in most languages. Galactus walked through it. He did not attack the fleets. He did not need to. His path simply continued, and where his path crossed a vessel, that vessel ceased to exist. Some ships were destroyed. Others were pushed aside by pressures they could not name. Entire formations were scattered like dust in a slow wind. The great combined might of the galaxy, gathered for the first time in unity, achieved exactly one thing. Not much of it. A few precious hours. Enough for Mark Grayson to reach the front of that vast figure once more, this time not alone. Beside him hovered a small, unlikely council. A senior Viltrumite commander whose face still carried the shadow of what he had witnessed. A coalition scientist who had spent the last month sleeping only in short, broken intervals. An elder from one of the ancient civilizations they had visited during their search, whose eyes held the calm of someone who had already accepted several possible endings. Mark spoke first. He offered the alternative. He described in careful and steady words a dying celestial body they had located deep in the empty regions between galaxies. It was immense beyond comfortable measurement. Its core still burned with the raw energies of a creation that had occurred long before any of the current civilizations had risen. It carried no life. It carried no witnesses. It was, in every meaningful sense, a feast that would harm no one. He asked Galactus to consider it, not as a command, not as a bargain, simply as a possibility. There was a long silence. Behind Galactus, the stars continued their slow and different burning. Behind Mark, Earth turned quietly on its axis, unaware that its survival was being weighed in that moment by a being older than its sun. For the first time in an age that no historian could measure, Galactus paused. It was a small thing, that pause. A shift in posture. A slowing of the great slow steps that had carried him across so many universes. Yet in that small thing, every commander and every ship behind Mark felt the weight of it settle across their chests. Something was being considered that had perhaps never been considered before. The decision, they all understood, did not belong to any of them. It did not belong to the fleets. It did not belong to Mark. It did not belong to the empires that had once believed themselves the arbiters of every fate in this cosmos. It belonged entirely and only to the vast figure whose hunger had shaped the balance of realities for longer than any of them could imagine. And so they waited in silence for a god to make up his mind. Galactus accepted. He did not announce it with grandeur. He did not mark it with light or thunder. He simply turned slowly in the direction of the distant dying celestial body Mark had described and began to walk. That was all. A single change of direction, quiet as a thought, and Earth was spared. For a long moment, no one on any of the ships moved. It was as if the galaxy itself needed time to understand what had just happened. Then, one by one, small sounds began to return. A breath released, a hand unclenched, a prayer whispered in a language no one else in the room could recognize. The great combined fleet, gathered for what had felt like the last act of a very old story, discovered that it was still, somehow, at the beginning of another. Before he departed, Galactus spoke once more. He acknowledged them, all of them, not with praise, not with promises, simply with recognition. He told Mark that in all the universes he had walked through, in all the countless civilizations he had witnessed rise and fall, the capacity for hope in the face of impossible odds remained one of the few things that continued to surprise him. He did not call it strength. He did not call it wisdom. He called it, in his own strange and ancient way, worth noticing. Then he was gone. Not in a flash, not in a storm. He simply resumed his slow, patient stride into the deep between galaxies, and after a while, there was no longer any figure on the horizon at all. Only silence. Only the quiet return of ordinary time. The Viltrum Empire emerged from that day changed in ways it could not yet articulate. For 10,000 years its identity had rested on a single unshakable belief. Strength defined destiny. The strongest ruled. The strongest survived. The strongest were, by simple mathematical inevitability, the meaning of the universe itself. That belief had walked into the shadow of Galactus and had not walked out again. What replaced it was still forming, still tender, still uncertain. But it was there. A slow, uncomfortable understanding that greatness might involve something more than the capacity to break another being. Mark Grayson never spoke publicly about his encounter. He did not need to. His silence carried the story more clearly than any speech could have. Younger Viltrumites watched him and drew their own conclusions. Some of them quietly began to change. Mark returned to Earth and, for a time, tried to live like an ordinary man. He held his daughter. He shared long evenings with his wife. He listened to old music and let himself finally be tired. He understood, in a way he had never understood before, that some victories were not measured in the enemies you defeated. They were measured in the mornings that were still allowed to arrive. Across the galaxy, civilizations began to rebuild. Trade routes reopened between former enemies. Refugees found homes on worlds that had once been closed to them. Alliances that had been forged in desperation slowly hardened into something that resembled trust. It was not a golden age. It was a fragile, cautious, quietly stubborn peace. In many ways, that made it more valuable than any age of gold ever could have been. Yet in every quiet moment, in every distant observatory, in every whispered story passed between generations, a new understanding settled into the bones of the Invincible Universe. There were empires. There were wars. There were heroes and tyrants and long, complicated histories that filled the libraries of 1,000 worlds. And beyond all of them, beyond every conquest, beyond every dream of dominion, there were powers so vast that entire universes were merely passing moments in their endless journey. The stars remembered. The stars would always remember. And somewhere, in the great dark between galaxies, a slow figure walked on.